Malcolm Gaines stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony. The city sprawled before him in golden hues as the sun dipped behind the horizon. To any onlooker, this was a portrait of achievement. A man who had climbed the towering ladder of success, who had defied every odds stacked against him. But beneath the polished exterior, Malcolm felt the familiar weight of unease, a quiet, persistent hum that never fully faded. This was supposed to be a moment of clarity, of triumph. For years, Malcolm had built an empire with his hands, his grit, and a vision that refused to be dimmed by the doubts of others. And now, he was on the brink of acquiring a private jet, not for vanity, but for purpose. It was a means to reach underserved communities, to expand his philanthropic efforts, to act on the promise he had made to himself years ago, to use his success as a tool for change. Yet, as he stood there, surveying the city, a part of him questioned whether such dreams were ever fully his to own. Malcolm was no stranger to the peculiar brand of tension that came with being a black man in spaces that were not built with him in mind. It was there in the too long pauses before handshakes at board meetings, the surprised glances when he walked into luxury spaces, the subtle but sharp edges of doubt that people cloaked in smiles. Those moments were easy enough to brush aside until they weren't. The question wasn't whether he belonged. Malcolm knew that he did. The question was why the world still seemed determined to ask. The decision to buy the jet had been years in the making, spurred by a trip to a rural community in the Midwest. He had been invited to speak at a school where the halls were quiet with neglect, the students eager but visibly burdened by the weight of what they lacked. Malcolm had sat with them, listened to their stories, and promised to return with more than words. On the flight back, cramped in a coach seat that barely contained his 6'4" frame, the idea took root. What if he could go further, faster, and deliver more? What if the success he had fought for could become a vessel for others to dream bigger? But Malcolm knew the world wouldn't see it that way. To some, a black man with a private jet was an affront, a challenge to the invisible rules that dictated who could rise and how high. He had seen it before, the way admiration curdled into suspicion, how success too quickly became something he needed to defend. And yet, Malcolm had resolved to push forward, because the alternative, accepting the limits others placed on him, was unthinkable. The evening's quiet was broken by the ringing of his phone. Malcolm turned, walking back inside. The penthouse was modern, all clean lines and muted tones, but the walls carried pieces of his past. Framed photographs of family gatherings, awards he had almost been too proud to display, a faded basketball jersey from his college days. Malcolm. His assistant Dana's voice came through, brisk but warm. They've finalized everything for tomorrow. The jet's ready. He paused, letting the words settle. Good. It's about time. You nervous? Dana asked, though they both knew the answer. Not about the flight, he replied, his voice steady. It's everything else. People don't like to see someone like me in places like this. Dana hesitated before responding. Maybe, she said finally, but that's exactly why you're doing this. To show them you deserve to be there because you've earned it. The morning came sharp and clear, the airstrip bathed in the soft glow of dawn. Malcolm stepped out of his car, dressed in a tailored navy suit that matched the sleek lines of the jet waiting for him. Technicians moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for the flight. Malcolm exhaled, taking in the sight of the aircraft, a symbol of what he had achieved and what he intended to give back. He had barely taken a step when he heard a voice call out behind him. Excuse me, sir. Can I help you? Malcolm turned to see a security guard approaching, his posture stiff, his expression guarded. I'm here for my flight, Malcolm said simply, gesturing toward the jet. The guard's eyes narrowed. This is a private airstrip. You need clearance to be here. Malcolm's jaw tightened. I have clearance. That's my plane. The guard's eyebrows lifted, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. Your plane? He repeated, his tone laced with incredulity. I'm gonna need to see some ID. Malcolm pulled out his wallet, handing over his driver's license and the laminated card verifying his ownership of the aircraft. The guard examined the documents, his lips pressing into a thin line. How exactly did you afford something like this? The guard asked, his voice low but biting. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Malcolm had encountered this before, this unspoken suspicion that no matter how much he achieved, how hard he worked, he was still out of place. The guard's words were just another iteration of what he had heard all his life. You don't belong here. He could feel the eyes of the crew on him, their curiosity mingled with unease. Malcolm straightened his posture, his voice calm but firm. I earned it, he said, and I don't owe you an explanation. The guard's face hardened. Wait here, he said, stepping aside to radio for backup. Moments later, Malcolm heard the distant wail of sirens. As police cars pulled onto the airstrip, Malcolm felt a familiar mix of anger and resignation rise within him. He thought of the students in that Midwest school, the promises he had made to himself and to them. The very people he intended to help would see this moment, this public display of doubt, and wonder if they too would face these same obstacles even at the height of their success. Malcolm stood firm as the officers approached, their skepticism evident. He handed over his documents again, keeping his movements deliberate. The verification process dragged on, every minute chipping away at what should have been a moment of triumph. Finally, an officer returned his papers. Everything checks out. You're free to go. Am I? Malcolm replied, his voice quiet but sharp. Because you've already made it clear you think I don't belong. The officer hesitated, but before he could respond, Malcolm turned toward his jet. The morning sun glinted off its surface, a beacon of what he had built and the barriers he still had to break. As he climbed the steps and entered the cabin, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. This was supposed to be a new chapter, a celebration of how far he had come. Instead, it was a reminder of how much further there was to go. As the engines roared to life and the jet began its ascent, Malcolm stared out the window, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just his fight, it was a fight for everyone who dared to dream beyond the limits the world tried to impose. The hum of the jet's engines filled the cabin as Malcolm Gaines leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky stretched endlessly in shades of gold and blue. It should have been a moment of victory, of unfiltered pride. He was thousands of feet above the world that had so often tried to press him down, but the weight of the morning clung to him, heavy and unrelenting. The guard's words echoed in his mind. You don't belong here. It wasn't the first time Malcolm had heard those words, not always spoken aloud, but implied, lingering in the spaces where others refused to see him for who he was. They had followed him from his childhood, through his days as a student, and into every corner of his success. He had thought naively, perhaps, that they would disappear once he had made it. Instead, they merely changed their tone, became sharper, quieter, and more insidious. The plane leveled out, and Malcolm reached for a glass of water from the console. Across from him sat Dana, her tablet glowing softly as she reviewed their schedule. She had been silent since they took off, but now she glanced up, her eyes cautious. You're not yourself, she said. What happened back there? Are you okay? Malcolm set the glass down, his grip firm but trembling slightly. You saw what happened, he replied. How do you think I feel? Dana hesitated, then leaned forward, her voice low and careful. I know it's not fair, but you handled it the way you always do, calm, steady. Most people wouldn't have been able to keep it together. That's the problem, Malcolm said, his voice tightening. Why should I have to keep it together? Why is it always on me to prove that I belong? I've built everything they said I couldn't, and it still isn't enough. The tension in the cabin thickened, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Malcolm turned toward the window, watching the clouds roll past. His mind traveled back to moments he rarely spoke of, moments that still lived in the shadows of his memory. He thought of his father, a man who worked tirelessly as a janitor in a school that barely noticed his presence. Malcolm could still hear his father's voice, low and steady, warning him about the world he would face. You're gonna have to work twice as hard to get half as far, his father had said, his words a mix of resignation and hope. But don't let them make you forget who you are. Malcolm had clung to those words, using them as a shield, but shields could only bear so much. He remembered a particular day in high school, a guidance counselor who had told him, in no uncertain terms, that college wasn't for kids like him. The memory stung as sharply now as it did then. He had proven her wrong. But at what cost? Every achievement, every milestone had come with a side dish of doubt served by people who couldn't see past his skin. Dana interrupted his thoughts. "You can't let them win, Malcolm." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Win? They've already set the rules. This morning wasn't just about me. It was about every person who's ever had to stand there, being questioned, being told they don't belong. And the worst part is they think they're justified. That guard didn't think he was being racist, he thought he was doing his job."
Dana sighed.
"It's not always about their intentions. It's about the impact." Malcolm nodded slowly, her words settling into him. "But what do we do about it? How do you change a world that doesn't want to admit it's broken?" Dana didn't have an answer, and the silence that followed was deafening. The plane began its descent, the city below growing larger, its lights twinkling against the approaching dusk. Malcolm watched as the familiar skyline came into view. He was heading to a school in an underserved neighborhood, a place where students would look at him and see the embodiment of possibility. And yet, how could he tell them to dream big when he himself was still pushing against walls that shouldn't exist? The jet landed smoothly, and Malcolm felt the weight of the day shift slightly as they taxied toward the private terminal. He could see the small crowd waiting for him, students, teachers, local leaders. Their smiles were warm, their hands eager to shake his, but Malcolm's chest tightened as he stepped off the plane. The echoes of the morning lingered, threatening to steal the joy from this moment. As he approached the group, a young boy in a worn jacket broke through the crowd, holding up a small notebook. "Mr. Gaines," the boy called, his voice high-pitched with excitement. "Can you sign this?" Malcolm knelt down, taking the notebook and pen. "What's your name?" "Terrence," the boy said, his eyes wide. "I want to be like you someday." Malcolm froze. The boy's words hit him harder than he expected, the weight of the morning collapsing into this single, fragile moment. He handed the notebook back, his smile warm but tinged with sadness. "You'll be better than me," he said, his voice steady. "And don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Later that evening, Malcolm sat in his hotel room, the city lights casting long shadows across the walls. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, the triumphs, the frustrations, the contradictions. Racism wasn't always a fist in the face or a shouted slur. Sometimes, it was a smirk, a sideways glance, a question that demanded justification where none should be needed. It was the weight of being doubted, the exhaustion of constantly having to prove your worth. But Malcolm knew that weight wasn't his alone to carry. It belonged to every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, to every Terrence who dared to dream despite the odds. And as he stared out at the city, his resolve solidified. This wasn't just about a jet or a guard or even himself. It was about challenging the rules that tried to keep him and so many others grounded. And Malcolm Gaines wasn't done flying. Not yet. The applause that greeted Malcolm Gaines as he entered the packed school auditorium was warm, but it didn't quite reach him. He smiled, nodded, and shook hands, but the earlier events of the day weighed heavily on his shoulders. The students stared up at him with wide, expectant eyes, their faces alight with hope. They had no idea what Malcolm had endured just hours before stepping off his plane, nor, he thought, should they. These young people, most of them black and brown, already carried enough burdens. He wasn't about to add his own. The principal, a wiry man with kind eyes, gestured toward the stage. "They're ready for you," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Malcolm nodded, climbing the stairs to the microphone. As he looked out over the sea of faces, he hesitated. He had prepared a speech, one that celebrated resilience and ambition, but the words now felt hollow. He thought about the security guard, the police, the humiliation, and the unspoken truth that none of it was new. He could push those memories down, pretend they hadn't happened, and deliver the polished inspiration they expected. Or he could tell the truth. He cleared his throat. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but weighted. "When I was a boy, I dreamed of moments like this, standing before an audience, sharing what I've learned, hoping to inspire. But I have to be honest with you. Today, I'm struggling. The room fell silent, the energy shifting. The students leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. The teachers exchanged nervous glances. Before I came here, Malcolm continued, I was stopped by a security guard at the airstrip where my plane was waiting. He didn't believe it was mine. Even after I showed him proof, he called the police. I stood there, waiting for them to verify what I already knew, that I belonged there. It didn't matter that I had worked hard, that I had earned everything I have. To him, I was out of place. The silence in the room was palpable. Malcolm paused, letting his words settle over the audience like a weight. He saw the recognition in their eyes, the subtle shifts in posture, the glances exchanged. They knew the story, not his, but their own versions of it. A mother pulled over for driving a too nice car. A teenager followed through a store. A father overlooked for a promotion. It's easy to tell ourselves that success will shield us, Malcolm said, his voice rising slightly. That if we just work hard enough, prove ourselves enough, we'll finally be accepted. But that's not the world we live in. And I'm tired of pretending it is. The students began to nod, their faces somber. Malcolm noticed a girl in the front row with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression a mix of anger and determination. He recognized that look. It was the same one he'd worn as a teenager, sitting in classrooms where teachers doubted his potential. I don't tell you this to discourage you, Malcolm said. I tell you because you deserve the truth. The world will question your worth. It will try to put limits on your dreams. But you don't have to accept those limits. He stepped away from the microphone, walking closer to the edge of the stage. The security guard who stopped me today thought he could define me, but he couldn't, and neither can anyone else define you. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Malcolm barely heard it. He had expected a sense of relief after speaking his truth, but instead, there was only a deeper ache. He stayed after the assembly, shaking hands and posing for photos, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Later, as he walked through the school's narrow halls, the principal caught up to him. That was powerful, he said, his voice tinged with hesitation. But I have to ask, do you think it was too much? Malcolm stopped, turning to face him. Too much, he repeated. For the kids, the principal clarified. They're already dealing with so much. Maybe they need hope more than reality. Malcolm considered this. He understood the principal's concern, but he couldn't ignore the fire in that girl's eyes or the way the students had sat, rapt as he spoke. Hope without truth is just another lie, he said finally. They deserve better than that. That evening, Malcolm sat in his hotel room, scrolling through his phone. The internet was alive with discussions about his viral video from the day before. Most of the comments were supportive, but there was also a steady stream of backlash. This is just another celebrity playing the victim. Maybe if he acted like he belonged, he wouldn't have been stopped. We're so tired of hearing about racism. Move on. Malcolm sighed, setting the phone down. He had expected the negativity, but it still stung. For every person who understood, there were two who refused to see. He thought about his father again, the quiet dignity with which he had endured countless slights. But Malcolm wasn't sure he could do the same. He didn't want to endure. He wanted to fight. The next morning, Malcolm met Dana in the hotel lobby. She held up her tablet, her face alight with urgency. CNN wants an interview, she said. They're picking up the story. Malcolm hesitated. He had always preferred action over words, but the thought of staying silent felt unbearable. The world needed to hear, not just for him but for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. Let's do it, he said, his voice firm. As they left the hotel, Malcolm felt the familiar weight of the world's expectations pressing against him. But this time he carried it differently, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. The challenges ahead would be greater, he knew, the backlash louder. But so too would be the strength of those who stood with him, who saw his fight as their own. And that, he realized, was enough to keep going. The studio lights were bright, too bright, and Malcolm Gaines felt the heat of them against his skin. The CNN anchor was seated across from him, her polished expression a mixture of professional curiosity and cautious empathy. Cameras loomed like silent judges, capturing every flicker of his face. Malcolm adjusted his tie, reminded again of his father's words. When they're watching, son, make sure they see a man who knows his worth. The interview began with polite questions. His background, his philanthropic work, his vision for the future. Malcolm answered smoothly, the cadence of his voice measured, careful. But he knew the anchor was circling closer to the real reason they were here. And when she asked about the incident at the airstrip, the air seemed to tighten. Malcolm, the anchor said, leaning forward slightly, your story has sparked a national conversation about race and privilege, but some have questioned whether the guard's actions were truly about race or just a misunderstanding. How do you respond to that? Malcolm exhaled slowly, a deliberate pause. He could feel the weight of the moment, the way his words would ripple far beyond this room. I think, he began, that it's easy for people to call something a misunderstanding when they've never been on the receiving end of it. What happened to me wasn't just about one guard or one morning. It's about a system that has taught people to doubt my humanity before they see my credentials. He could see the anchor stiffen slightly, her professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second. But surely, she said, not every experience of skepticism is rooted in race. How can we draw that line? Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm. The line isn't always visible, he said. That's the point. Racism isn't always a slur or a threat. Sometimes it's a look, a hesitation, a question that wouldn't be asked of someone else. It's the weight of constantly having to prove you deserve the space you're in. The segment ended, the anchor thanking him with a handshake that felt too firm, as though compensating for something unspoken. Malcolm stepped off the set, the adrenaline still coursing through him. Dana was waiting in the wings, her expression unreadable. Well, he asked. You were brilliant, she said, but you've stirred the hornet's nest. By the time Malcolm returned to his hotel, the interview was everywhere. Social media buzzed with reactions, some cheering his courage, others dismissing him as just another celebrity playing the race card. He scrolled through the comments, his chest tightening as the vitriol mounted. If he's so successful, why is he complaining? Here we go again, making everything about race. Maybe he should focus on the real problems instead of whining about a little inconvenience. Malcolm tossed the phone onto the bed and rubbed his temples. He had expected this, of course. Every time he had dared to speak up, there were always those who tried to shout him down. But knowing didn't make it easier. The next morning, Malcolm visited the airstrip where his jet was housed. He had a meeting with the company's management to discuss the incident, but as he arrived, he noticed the way the employees watched him. Their glances were quick, but their meanings lingered. Curiosity, suspicion, resentment. The receptionist smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Gaines, she said, her voice overly polite. Right this way. The meeting was tense from the start. The airstrip's director, a middle-aged man with a politician's smile, began with a carefully worded apology. We regret the unfortunate situation that occurred, he said, his hands folded neatly on the table. But I assure you it was not a matter of race. Our guard was simply following protocol. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Protocol? He repeated. Does your protocol involve questioning ownership based on someone's appearance? The director hesitated. Of course not. But you must understand, private aviation is a high-security environment. Mistakes can happen. Mistakes, Malcolm said, his voice sharp, are not the same as patterns. This wasn't the first time something like this has happened to me or to people who look like me. You want to call it a mistake so you don't have to look deeper. The director shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. Malcolm stood, the meeting over in his mind. You don't need to apologize to me, he said. You need to ask yourselves why it happened in the first place and what you're going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. He walked out of the office, the receptionist's forced smile following him. That evening, Malcolm sat in a small diner near the hotel, his thoughts swirling. The city outside was alive with neon lights and the hum of traffic, but inside, the quiet was almost suffocating. As he waited for his coffee, he noticed an older man seated at the counter, watching him. The man wore a weathered jacket and a baseball cap, his face lined with years of hard labor. "You're that guy on TV," the man said, his voice gravelly. "The one with the jet." Malcolm nodded cautiously. "That's me." The man leaned closer. "I don't get it," he said. "You've got everything. What are you so mad about?" Malcolm studied him for a moment, then spoke slowly. "It's not about being mad. It's about wanting better for everyone." The man frowned. "But you made it. Doesn't that mean the system works?" Malcolm's chest tightened. He thought of his father, of the sacrifices that had paved his path. He thought of the students who looked at him and saw their own dreams reflected back. "No," he said finally. "It means I've been lucky enough to slip through the cracks. But cracks shouldn't exist." The man didn't reply, but Malcolm saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of understanding, or maybe just curiosity. Either way, it was enough. As Malcolm left the diner, he felt the weight of the day pressing harder against him. The fight wasn't just against systems or policies. It was against the deeply rooted beliefs that shaped them. The quiet, insidious ways racism worked its way into daily life, into glances, into doubts, into silences were harder to confront than any shouting match. But Malcolm knew that was exactly why he couldn't stop. The sky above was dark, the stars barely visible against the city's glow. As he looked up, he thought again of his father's words, of the countless sacrifices that had brought him to this moment. He was tired, bone tired, but he wasn't done. The fight wasn't just his. It never had been. And as long as there was air to breathe and a sky to reach for, Malcolm Gaines would keep going. The murmurs began the moment Malcolm Gaines stepped into the banquet hall. It was a high-profile fundraiser, the kind that oozed with quiet opulence. Sleek chandeliers, polished silverware, and an air thick with exclusivity. Men in tailored suits exchanged tight smiles. Women in elegant gowns floated through the space, and the subtle choreography of wealth and power was on full display. Malcolm, dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit, was no stranger to such rooms, but tonight felt different. The whispers weren't loud, but they carried. He felt them more than heard them, a sharp undercurrent of speculation and judgment. His face was now as recognizable as the stories that had swirled around him since the airstrip incident. Some called him courageous, others accused him of stirring trouble where none existed. As he moved toward his table, he caught fragments of conversations that trailed just far enough to avoid confrontation. "Isn't he the one with the private jet scandal? Always playing the victim card. Isn't he?" Malcolm clenched his jaw but kept walking, the weight of their stares pressing against his back. The evening speeches began with predictable ease, a parade of well-rehearsed gratitude and calls to action. The crowd responded with polite applause, their attention flickering between the podium and their glasses of wine. When Malcolm's turn came to speak, the room quieted noticeably. He approached the stage with measured steps, his mind racing with the words he wanted to say versus the words he thought they might be willing to hear. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady but charged with an undercurrent of tension. "I stand here tonight as someone who has been blessed with opportunities one never thought possible. But I also stand here as someone who is constantly reminded that, no matter how far I've come, there are those who believe I don't belong." The room stiffened. Malcolm could feel the discomfort ripple through the audience, a collective bracing for a truth they had not come to confront. "There's a myth we like to tell ourselves," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "A myth that success erases prejudice, that if you work hard enough, achieve enough, you'll finally escape the weight of other people's doubts. But that myth is just another cage. A quieter one, perhaps, but a cage nonetheless." He paused, scanning the room. Some faces were sympathetic, others were inscrutable, but a few were openly hostile. "I'm not here to make anyone comfortable," Malcolm said. "Comfort never changed the world. I'm here because the fight against prejudice doesn't end with success, it merely changes its form. And if we don't confront it, if we don't name it, we allow it to thrive. The applause that followed was polite but sparse. Malcolm stepped down from the stage, his heart heavy but his resolve intact. As he made his way back to his table, an older man intercepted him. He was impeccably dressed, with the kind of practiced smile that rarely reached his eyes. "Mr. Gaines," the man said, extending a hand. "That was provocative." "Thank you," Malcolm replied, his tone cautious. The man's smile widened, though it lacked warmth. "You know, some might say that you're focusing too much on division. We've made so much progress, don't you think it's time to move on?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Move on to what exactly?" "To unity," the man replied, as though it were the simplest answer in the world. "We can't keep dredging up the past. At some point, we have to let go." Malcolm's chest tightened. He had heard this argument before, always delivered with the same tone of condescension disguised as concern. "Letting go," he said slowly, "is a luxury for those who haven't lived with the weight of it. The past isn't something we dredge up, it's something we're still living." The man's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly, offering a curt nod before disappearing into the crowd. Later that night, as Malcolm returned to his hotel, he found himself replaying the conversation in his mind. He had spent much of his life navigating such interactions calm on the surface, but beneath it, a quiet storm of frustration. The older man's words were a reminder of how deeply ingrained the denial of racism was, especially among those who believed themselves untouched by its reach. As he stepped into his room, his phone buzzed with a text from Dana. "Call me when you're free. Something's come up." Malcolm hesitated before dialing. Dana answered immediately, her tone brisk but tinged with unease. "Malcolm, I just got off the phone with the director of the airstrip where the incident happened. They're releasing a public statement tomorrow." "What kind of statement?" Malcolm asked, his voice sharpening. "They're apologizing," Dana said, "but they're framing it as a misunderstanding, not as profiling. They're calling it an unfortunate miscommunication." Malcolm closed his eyes, his grip tightening on the phone. "Of course they are. It gets worse," Dana continued. "The guard who stopped you? He's suing. Claims he's the victim of defamation." The room felt colder suddenly, the walls pressing in around him. Malcolm sank into a chair, his mind racing. The lawsuit wasn't about justice. It was about silencing him, about turning the narrative on its head. "You don't have to fight this alone," Dana said, her voice softer now. "You've got people who believe in you." Malcolm nodded, though she couldn't see him. He thought of the students he had spoken to, the faces that had looked at him with hope. He thought of his father's quiet strength, of the countless others who didn't have the platform he did. "I'm not backing down," he said finally, his voice firm. "They can try to silence me, but I won't let them." Malcolm Gaines stared at the legal documents spread out across his desk. The guard's lawsuit was as audacious as it was insulting, a brazen attempt to rewrite the narrative and shift the blame. The language of the complaint was clinical but cutting, accusing Malcolm of defamation, of harming the guard's reputation, of turning an innocent misunderstanding into a media spectacle. It was a stark reminder of how power, when challenged, often fought back not with truth, but with distortion. The air in Malcolm's office felt stifling, despite the wide windows that framed the city skyline. He could see the life below, cars inching through traffic, pedestrians moving with purpose, but the distance between himself and that world felt vast. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a symbolic one. To back down would be to accept the lie, to let the world believe that what had happened at the airstrip was an anomaly instead of a reflection of a much deeper wound. Dana sat across from him, her expression unreadable. "We can fight this," she said, breaking the silence. "You know that." "I know," Malcolm replied, his voice measured. "But that's not what worries me." "Then what does?" Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting to the window. "The cost," he said quietly. "Not just to me, but to the people watching. The ones who see this and wonder if speaking up is worth it." The lawsuit wasn't the only storm brewing. Malcolm's name had become a flashpoint in the national conversation about race, privilege, and accountability. Some hailed him as a hero, a symbol of resilience and courage. Others painted him as an agitator, a man stirring trouble where none existed. The weight of those conflicting narratives was relentless, pressing down on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. At the same time, Malcolm was determined not to lose sight of his mission. Wings of Hope was expanding rapidly, with new partnerships forming and additional flights scheduled to serve underserved communities. The program was everything he had envisioned, a tangible way to transform his pain into progress. But even here, the challenges mounted. On one of the program's scheduled flights, Malcolm accompanied a team delivering supplies to a hurricane-stricken region in the south. The devastation was staggering, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, families huddled in makeshift shelters, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Malcolm had seen hardship before, but this was different. It was raw, immediate, impossible to ignore. As he helped unload crates of food and medical supplies, a volunteer approached him. She was a white woman in her late 50s, her face lined with years of hard work. She extended a hand, her grip firm. "Mr. Gaines," she said, "I appreciate what you're doing here, but I have to ask, why make this about race? Isn't helping people enough?" Malcolm stiffened, the question hitting him like a slap. He forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Helping people is the goal," he said evenly. "But ignoring the systems that create the need for this help, that's not enough." The woman frowned, her expression skeptical. "Seems like talking about race just divides people. We've come so far, don't you think it's time to focus on unity?" Malcolm's smile faded. He had heard this argument before, wrapped in well-meaning tones but rooted in denial. "Unity without truth isn't unity at all," he said. "It's silence. And silence doesn't heal wounds, it hides them." The woman didn't respond, but the tension lingered between them as they returned to their work. That evening, as the plane flew back to its home base, Malcolm sat alone near the window, the cabin dimly lit. The volunteer's words replayed in his mind, mingling with the noise of the lawsuit, the media, and the ever-present whispers of doubt. He thought about the people he had met that day, their resilience, their pain, their quiet determination to rebuild. He thought about the students he had spoken to weeks earlier, their faces alight with hope but shadowed by the weight of their realities. Racism, Malcolm realized, wasn't just about individual acts of hate. It was about the quiet ways it shaped lives, the unspoken rules it imposed, the invisible barriers it built. It was about the systems that allowed suffering to persist, unchecked and unacknowledged, because acknowledging it meant confronting uncomfortable truths. When the plane landed, Malcolm was greeted by a small group of reporters. Their questions came rapid-fire, sharp and probing. "Mr. Gaines, how do you respond to those who say you're making this about yourself? Do you think your focus on race is overshadowing the good work your program is doing? Some say your approach is divisive. How do you address that?" Malcolm raised a hand, his expression calm but resolute. "The work we're doing isn't about me," he said. "It's about the people who need help and the systems that have failed them. And if talking about race makes people uncomfortable, that's a discomfort we need to face. Because the alternative is pretending these issues don't exist, and that's not a luxury we can afford." As the reporters dispersed, Malcolm felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Dana, her expression both weary and proud. "You handled that well," she said. "Did I?" Malcolm asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Dana nodded. "You said what needed to be said, even if they don't want to hear it." The courtroom was quiet except for the faint shuffle of papers and the distant hum of air conditioning. Malcolm Gaines sat at the defendant's table, his posture steady, his expression unreadable. The guard's lawsuit had brought him here, transforming a moment of humiliation at an airstrip into a spectacle of accusations and counterarguments. It was surreal, sitting in a space designed to uphold justice while the very concept felt warped, stretched thin by the weight of a system built to protect those who upheld its unspoken rules. Across the room, the guard sat with his legal team, his face a mask of righteousness. He looked nothing like the man who had smirked at Malcolm that morning on the tarmac. Here, he was polished, his demeanor carefully curated to evoke sympathy. The contrast was striking, but not unfamiliar. Malcolm had seen this transformation before the way prejudice, when called out, cloaked itself in innocence and victimhood. The guard's attorney rose to speak, his voice smooth and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the jury, "this is not a case about race. It's a case about misunderstanding, about protocol, about a man simply doing his job." He gestured toward Malcolm without looking at him. "But my client has been vilified, his reputation tarnished. All because Mr. Gaines chose to interpret a routine security check as something sinister." Malcolm's hands tightened around the edges of the table, his knuckles whitening. The words felt like daggers, each one cutting deeper into a truth the attorney had no intention of acknowledging. When it was his turn to take the stand, Malcolm felt the weight of every eye in the room. He had prepared for this moment, rehearsing his words, steeling himself against the inevitable attacks on his character. But as he sat down and faced the jury, the enormity of it all pressed down on him. "Mr. Gaines," the guard's attorney began, his tone polite but pointed, "you've claimed that my client's actions were motivated by racial bias. Can you provide concrete evidence of that bias?" Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. "Bias isn't always something you can hold in your hand," he replied. "It's in the questions that are asked, the assumptions that are made. It's in the way a man looks at you like you're guilty before you've even said a word." The attorney smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's a very compelling narrative, Mr. Gaines. But isn't it possible that my client was simply doing his job? That your interpretation was influenced by your own assumptions?" Malcolm felt a surge of anger but kept his voice calm. "My assumptions," he said, "are based on a lifetime of experience. On moments like this, where I'm asked to defend my right to exist in spaces people don't think I belong." The trial stretched on for days, each one more grueling than the last. Witnesses were called, arguments made, and the courtroom became a theater of subtle but palpable tension. The guard's legal team painted him as a diligent employee, a man caught in the crossfire of a larger cultural debate. Malcolm's team focused on the systemic patterns that had led to this moment, drawing connections that many in the room seemed reluctant to acknowledge. Outside the courthouse, the world watched with bated breath. Protesters gathered on the steps, some holding signs of support for Malcolm, others demanding he stop playing the race card. News outlets dissected every moment of the trial, their coverage reflecting the country's fractured perspectives on race and accountability. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, Malcolm sat alone in his hotel room. The city lights flickered outside the window, their glow muted by the heavy curtains. His phone buzzed with notifications, but he ignored them. Instead, he stared at a photograph on the desk, a black and white image of his father standing in front of their old house, his hands calloused from years of labor. Malcolm thought of his father's quiet strength, the way he had endured the daily indignities of his job without ever letting them define him. He had taught Malcolm to fight, but also to choose his battles carefully. "Some fights," his father had once said, "ain't about winning or losing. They're about showing them you won't break." The next day, Malcolm took the stand again, this time under questioning from his own attorney. The questions were simple, but his answers carried the weight of a lifetime. "Mr. Gaines," his attorney asked, "why didn't you walk away from this? Why pursue justice in a case so many people would have let go?" Malcolm took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Because walking away doesn't make it stop. Ignoring it doesn't make it better. If I don't speak up, what does that say to the people who look like me? The ones who don't have the platform I do? This isn't just about me, it's about every person who's ever been told, in words or actions, that they don't belong." The courtroom was silent, the tension almost unbearable. Malcolm looked out at the jury, at the faces that seemed torn between understanding and resistance. He wasn't just speaking to them. He was speaking to a country that had spent centuries avoiding its own reflection. When the trial concluded, the jury deliberated for hours. Malcolm waited in a small, windowless room with his legal team, the air thick with anticipation. Finally, the verdict came. The jury found in favor of Malcolm, dismissing the guard's lawsuit. The decision was a victory, but it felt hollow. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their questions sharp and relentless. How do you feel about the verdict? Do you think this trial has helped or hurt the conversation about race? What's next for you, Mr. Gaines? Malcolm paused, his gaze steady as he addressed the crowd. This isn't about winning or losing, he said. It's about making people see what they've been taught to ignore. And if this trial has done that, even a little, then it's worth it. That night, Malcolm stood on the balcony of his hotel, the city stretching endlessly before him. The fight wasn't over, he knew that. The trial was just one battle in a war that had been raging long before he was born. But as he looked out at the lights below, he felt a flicker of hope. Not because the world had changed, but because he had refused to let it silence him. For Malcolm Gaines, that was enough to keep going. For now, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the city in shades of amber and rust. Malcolm Gaines stood on the rooftop of a community center he had helped fund, watching as the last rays of daylight stretched across the skyline. Below, the hum of activity filled the air, volunteers preparing meals, children running through a basketball court, parents huddled in quiet conversation. It was a scene Malcolm had dreamed of creating, yet tonight it felt fragile, as though it could all be swept away by the next storm. The trial was over. He had won. But victory had not brought the peace he had hoped for. Instead, it had amplified the noise, critics accusing him of playing the victim, supporters urging him to take on even larger fights. Everyone wanted something from him, and Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of their expectations was pressing him closer to the edge. As he descended the stairs into the center, he was greeted by Dana, her ever-present tablet in hand. She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You're trending again," she said, holding up the screen. "Your speech outside the courthouse is everywhere." Malcolm glanced at the screen but didn't respond. He had grown weary of seeing his face on every platform, his words dissected and repackaged for public consumption. "They're asking what's next," Dana continued, her tone cautious. "What do you want to tell them?" Malcolm paused, his gaze drifting to a group of teenagers gathered near a corner of the room. They were laughing, their energy filling the space, but he could see the weight they carried, subtle but unmistakable. He had been their age once, full of dreams that felt impossibly large. The world had tried to tell him he didn't belong then, just as it did now. And yet, here he was. "I'll tell them the truth," he said finally. "That the fight isn't over. That it never was." Later that evening, Malcolm attended a private fundraiser for Wings of Hope. The room was filled with familiar faces, business leaders, activists, philanthropists, all eager to show their support. The event was polished, every detail carefully curated, but Malcolm felt out of place. These were the people who had cheered his success, but many of them had also remained silent during his struggles. Their applause came easily now, but he wondered how many of them would stand beside him when the spotlight faded. As the evening progressed, Malcolm was approached by a young man in his early 20s. His suit was slightly too big, his movements hesitant but determined. "Mr. Gaines," he said, extending a hand, "I just wanted to thank you. Your story, it gave me the courage to apply for a scholarship I didn't think I'd get. And now I'm starting flight school." Malcolm shook his hand, a genuine smile breaking through his fatigue. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marcus," the young man replied. "I want to be a pilot someday." "You will be," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "And when you get there, remember this moment. Remember that you belong." The fundraiser ended late, and Malcolm found himself walking alone along the waterfront. The city was quiet now, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. He thought about Marcus, about the children at the community center, about the guard who had tried to humiliate him. The world was filled with contradictions, moments of profound connection and deep division, triumphs that felt incomplete. He had fought so hard to reach this point, yet the horizon always seemed to stretch further away. For every battle he won, there were 10 more waiting. The exhaustion was real, but so was the hope. The next morning, Malcolm boarded his jet for a new mission. This time, Wings of Hope was delivering supplies to a rural hospital on the West Coast. As the plane ascended, He looked out the window, the clouds stretching endlessly beneath him. The world below was vast and complicated, filled with both beauty and pain. But up here, everything felt possible. Dana sat across from him, her tablet open. "You know," she said, her tone softer than usual, "you don't have to do it all. You can let someone else carry some of the weight." Malcolm turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe," he said, "but I don't know how to stop. Not when there's still so much work to do." Dana nodded, her gaze steady. "Just don't lose yourself in the fight," she said. "The world needs you, but it also needs you to be whole." Malcolm didn't respond immediately. He stared out the window, the planes slicing through the sky. He thought about his father, about the lessons he had learned, the battles he had fought. He thought about Marcus and the teenagers at the community center. He thought about the people who had come before him, who had paved the way, and the ones who would come after. "The fight doesn't end with me," he said finally. "It never does. But I'll carry it as far as I can."